Chapter 5 The 70 Years for Babylon begins with a quote from Jeremiah 29:10 from the New American Standard Bible. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place. The date 607 BCE, as given by Watchtower chronologists, for the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple by the Babylonians is determined by adding the 70 years predicted by Jeremiah to 537 BCE, the date when the Jewish remnant are thought to have returned from exile. It is held that these 70 years were a period of complete desolation for Judah and Jerusalem. Quote, the Bible prophecy does not allow for the application of the 70-year period to any other than that between the desolation of Judah, accompanying Jerusalem's destruction, and the return of the Jewish exiles to their homeland as a result of Cyrus' decree. It clearly specifies that the 70 years would be years of devastation of the land of Judah. End quote. If no other understanding of the 70-year period is allowed for by Bible prophecy, then a choice has to be made between the date determined by this application and the one established by at least 17 lines of historical evidence. When a certain interpretation of a biblical prophecy contradicts historical fact, this indicates that either the prophecy failed or the interpretation is wrong. It is true that a certain application sometimes looks very convincing, so much so that no other appears feasible. It seems to the reader to be given by the Bible itself. In such a case, it may also seem to be a sound Christian position to discard the historical evidence and just stick to what the Bible says. When this position is taken, however, those taking it often overlook the fact that the fulfillment of a prophecy cannot be demonstrated aside from history, because only history can show whether, when, and how it was fulfilled. Actually, prophecy is not generally understood until after it has been fulfilled historically through events in time. Serious mistakes have sometimes been made by sincere Bible students because historical evidence contrary to a certain application or interpretation has been rejected. One example will be given below to illustrate this fact. Subheading: History and Time Prophecies, a Lesson. Most commentators agree that Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks refers to a period of 490 years, but various opinions have been held regarding the starting point of this period. Although it is stated at Daniel 9:25 that from the going forth of the word to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the leader, there will be 7 weeks, also 62 weeks. Different views are held regarding when and by whom this word was sent forth. If we just stick to the Bible, it seems to point to the Persian king Cyrus. At Isaiah 44:28, Jehovah saith of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying of Jerusalem, She shall be built, and of the temple, thy foundation shall be laid. And further in chapter 45, verse 13, I myself have roused up someone in righteousness, Cyrus, and all his ways I shall straighten out. He is the one that will build my city, and those of mine in exile he will let go, not for a price nor for bribery. Thus it would seem clear that, according to the Bible itself, the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem was issued by Cyrus. This application, however, limits the period from Cyrus' edict until Messiah to 483 years, which is 7 weeks, also 62 weeks. If this period ended at the baptism of Christ, usually dated somewhere in the period of 26 to 29 CE, Cyrus' first year as king of Babylon would have to be dated in the period 458 to 455 BCE instead of 538, the historically acknowledged date. Contrary to all historical evidence, several Christian commentators in the past have chosen this application, and it is still adhered to by some expositors. The idea was popularized in the last century by Martin Anstey in his work, The Romance of Bible Chronology, produced in London in 1913. Dr. E. W. Bullinger, from 1837 to 1913, accepted the same position, as may be seen in Appendix 91 of his The Companion Bible. The reason underlying this unhistorical position It is clearly demonstrated by one of its adherents, George Storrs, a Bible student from the 19th century and editor of the periodical Bible Examiner. In an article dealing with the 70 weeks, he states, quote, "In examining this point, we have nothing to do with profane chronology, or the chronology of the historians. The Bible must settle the question, and if profane chronology does not tally with it, we have a right to conclude such chronology is false, and not to be trusted." End quote. Storrs, like some other expositors before and after him, tried to cut off nearly 100 years from the Persian period, holding that a number of the Persian kings mentioned in Ptolemy's canon, or the royal canon, and other historical sources never existed. George Storrs surely was an honest and sincere Christian Bible student, but his and others' rejection of historical sources proved to be a grave mistake. That the Persian kings mentioned in the royal canon really did exist has been proven beyond all doubt by archaeological discoveries in modern times. This is an instructive illustration of the necessity of considering the historical evidence in relation to biblical time prophecies. Although this special application of the 70 weeks seemed very biblical and very convincing, it has been refuted by historical facts and therefore cannot be correct. The same is also true of the application of the 70-year prophecy made by the Watchtower Society. Although on the surface it may seem to be supported by some passages in the Bible, it should be abandoned because it is incompatible with historical facts established by a multitude of modern discoveries. Is it possible then to find an application of the 70 years that accords with the historical evidence? It is, and a close examination of biblical texts dealing with the 70 years will demonstrate that there is no real conflict between the Bible and secular history in this matter. As will be shown below, it is the application made by the Watchtower Society that conflicts not only with secular history, but also with the Bible itself. There are 7 scriptural texts referring to a period of 70 years, which the Watchtower Society applies to one and the same period. Jeremiah 25:10-12 and 29:10, Daniel 9:1 and 2, 2 Chronicles 36:20-23, Zechariah 1:7-12 and 7:1-7, and Isaiah 23:15-18. These will now be examined one by one in chronological order. Subheading A. Jeremiah 25:10-12. The original prediction is that of Jeremiah 25:10-12, which is dated to, quote, "the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah, that is, the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon." End quote. Jehoiakim ruled for 11 years and was followed by his son Jehoiachin, who ruled for 3 months. Jehoiachin, in turn, was succeeded by his uncle Zedekiah, in whose 11th year Jerusalem was desolated. Jeremiah's prophecy, then, was given 18 years prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. Quoting Jeremiah 25:10-12, "And I will destroy out of them the sound of exultation and the sound of rejoicing, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the handmill and the light of the lamp. And all this land, Judah, must become a devastated place, an object of astonishment, and these nations will have to serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it must occur that when 70 years have been fulfilled, I shall call to account again the king of Babylon, and against that nation is the utterance of Jehovah, their error even against the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it desolate wastes to time indefinite." End quote. 3 things are predicted in this prophecy. 1, the land of Judah would become a devastated place. 2, these nations would serve the king of Babylon 70 years. 3, when the 70 years had been fulfilled, God would call to account against the king of Babylon and against that nation, their error, even against the land of the Chaldeans. What does this passage really tell us about the 70 years? Subheading A1. Desolation or servitude, which? Although it is predicted in the passage that the land of Judah would be a devastated place, it should be noted that this devastation is not equated with or linked with the period of the 70 years. All that is clearly and unambiguously stated in the text is that these nations will have to serve the king of Babylon 70 years. The phrase, these nations, is a reference back to verse 9, in which it is predicted that Nebuchadnezzar would come against this land, that is, Judah and its inhabitants, and also against all these nations round about. The 70 years then should be understood to mean years of servitude for these nations. This conclusion is so obvious that the Watchtower Society, at the head of page 826 of its large print edition of the New World Translation, the 1971 edition, automatically describes the 70 years as 70 years servitude due. Yet in their discussion of this text, Watchtower writers never point out that Jeremiah spoke of 70 years of servitude, or that this servitude related to the nations surrounding Judah. They try always to give the impression that the 70 years referred to Judah, and Judah only. And they always describe the 70 years as a period in which Judah suffered complete desolation without an inhabitant. This they reckon as having happened from the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. But their application is in direct conflict with the exact wording of Jeremiah's prediction, and it can be upheld only by ignoring what the text actually says. Servitude here should not be taken to mean the same thing as desolation and exile. For the nations surrounding Judah, the servitude first of all meant vassalage. Although Judah too was subdued by Babylon, it time and again revolted and attempted to throw off the Babylonian yoke, which brought wave after wave of devastating military ravages and deportations until the country was at last desolated and depopulated after the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. That such a fate was not the same thing as servitude, but would come as punishment upon any nation that refused to serve the king of Babylon, had been clearly predicted by Jeremiah at chapter 27, verses 7, 8, and 11. Quoting verse 7, "And all the nations must serve him, Nebuchadnezzar, and his son and his grandson, until the time even of his own land comes. And many nations and great kings must exploit him as a servant." Verse 8, "And it must occur that the nation and the kingdom that will not serve him, even Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, and the one that will not put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, with the sword and with the famine and with the pestilence I shall turn my attention upon that nation, is the utterance of Jehovah, until I have finished them off by his hand." Verse 11, "And as for the nation that will bring its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and actually serve him, I will also let it rest upon its ground, is the utterance of Jehovah, and it will certainly cultivate it and dwell in it." From these verses it is very clear what is meant to a nation to serve the king of Babylon. It meant to accept the yoke of Babylon as a vassal, and by that be spared from desolation and deportation. The servitude, therefore, was the very opposite of revolt, desolation, deportation, and exile. That's why Jeremiah warned the people against attempting to throw off the Babylonian yoke, and admonishing them, "Serve the king of Babylon and keep on living. Why should this city become a devastated place?" From Jeremiah 27:17. Thus the nation that accepted the Babylonian yoke would serve the king of Babylon 70 years. But the nations that refused to serve the Babylonian king would become devastated. This fate at last befell Judah after about 18 years of servitude, interrupted by repeated rebellions. The 70 years of servitude foretold by Jeremiah, therefore, do not apply to Judah as a nation, but only to the nations who submitted to the king of Babylon. As Judah refused to submit, it had to get the punishment for this, desolation and exile, exactly as had been predicted at Jeremiah 25:11. Of course, the exiled Jews also had to perform various kinds of service in Babylonia. This was not the service of a vassal state, however, but the service of captured and deported slaves. Subheading A2, when would the 70 years end? The prediction that these nations will have to serve the king of Babylon 70 years, at Jeremiah 25:11, implies that there would be a change in Babylon's position of supremacy at the end of the 70-year period. This change is described in verse 12 of Jeremiah 25. Quote, "And it must occur that when 70 years have been fulfilled, I shall call to account against the king of Babylon and against that nation, is the utterance of Jehovah, their error even against the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it desolate wastes to time indefinite." End quote. All historians, and also the Watchtower Society, agree that the Neo-Babylonian Empire ended in 539 BCE. On October 12 of the Julian calendar that year, the city of Babylon was captured by the armies of the Persian king Cyrus. Belshazzar, the son of King Nabonidus, was killed, according to the book of Daniel, chapter 5, verse 30. Nabonidus himself was taken prisoner and exiled to Carmania in the east, where he spent the rest of his life as governor of that province, according to Berossus. The year in which Jehovah would, quote, call to account against the king of Babylon and against the nations their error, even against the land of the Chaldeans, end quote, therefore was evidently 539 BCE. At that time, the 70 years had been fulfilled, according to Jeremiah's prophecy. The Persian conquest of Babylonia in 539 BCE definitely put an end to the Babylonian supremacy over the nations who had served as its vassals up to that year. After that year, it was impossible to serve the king of Babylon in any sense, either as vassals or as exiled captives in Babylonia. From that year onward, these people had to serve not the king of Babylon, but the king of Persia. The 70 years of servitude, therefore, definitely ended in 539 BCE, not later. Note, then, that Jeremiah's prophecy is clearly incompatible with the view that the 70 years referred to the period of the desolation of Judah and Jerusalem. Why? Because this desolation did not end in 539 BCE, but later, when a remnant of the Jewish exiles had returned to Judah as a result of Cyrus's edict. According to the Watchtower Society, this took place 2 years after the fall of Babylon, or in 537 BCE. In that year, they hold the 70 years ended. But how did Jehovah call to account against the king of Babylon and against that nation their error in 537 BCE, 2 years after his dethronement and the fall of Babylon? A solution to this problem has never been presented in the publications of the Watchtower Society. Subheading A3, the historical setting of the 70-year prophecy. If the 70 years ended in 539 BCE, when did they begin? Clearly, they cannot be counted from the year of the desolation to Jerusalem. The period from the established date of 587 BCE to 539 was only 48 years. However, as the 70 years have been shown above to refer to the period of subservience to Babylon, not to Jerusalem's desolation, the right question to be asked is, when did the period of servitude begin? First of all, it is important to establish the historical background against which this prophecy was given. As pointed out earlier, it was given 18 years before the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, quoting Jeremiah 25:1. That is, in 605 BCE. That year saw a very important event take place. With momentous consequences to Judah and its neighbors, it was the year of the well-known Battle of Carchemish on the Euphrates River in northern Syria, when Nebuchadnezzar decisively defeated the Egyptian pharaoh Necho and his military force. This important victory opened the way for the Babylonian king to the areas in the west, Syria and Palestine, which for a few years previous, 609 to 605 BCE, had been controlled by Egypt. This famous battle is also referred to and dated at Jeremiah 46:2, quote, "For Egypt, concerning the military force of Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, who happened to be by the river Euphrates at Carchemish, whom Nebuchadrezzar, the king of Babylon, defeated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah," end quote. The prophecy of the 70 years was thus given at a crucial point of time. Could it be that Judah and her neighbors were made vassals to and began to serve the king of Babylon in that year? Research does not find evidence to show that Judah and a number of the surrounding nations began to be made subservient to the king of Babylon very soon after the Battle of Carchemish in the 4th year of Jehoiakim and thereafter. In 1956, Professor D.J. Wiseman published a translation of the Babylonian Chronicle BM 21946. I need to correct that last paragraph. Research does find evidence to show that Judah and a number of the surrounding nations began to be made subservient to the king of Babylon very soon after the Battle of Carchemish in the 4th year of Jehoiakim and thereafter. In 1956, Professor D.J. Wiseman published a translation of the Babylonian Chronicle BM 21946, covering the period from that last 21st year of Nabopolassar up to and including the 10th year of his son and successor, Nebuchadnezzar. This tablet commences with a concise description of the battle at Carchemish and the subsequent events. The opening portion is quoted here in full because of its importance for our examination. Quote, "The 21st year, the king of Akkad stayed home while Nebuchadnezzar II, his eldest son, and the crown prince mustered the army of Akkad. He took his army's lead and marched to Carchemish, which is on the bank of the Euphrates. He crossed the river to encounter the army of Egypt, which was encamped at Carchemish. They did battle together. The army of Egypt retreated before him. He inflicted a defeat upon them and finished them off completely. In the district of Hamath, the army of Akkad overtook the remainder of the army of Egypt, which managed to escape from the defeat and which was not overcome. They, the army of Akkad, inflicted a defeat upon them so that a single Egyptian man did not return home. At that time, Nebuchadnezzar II conquered all of Hamath. For 21 years, Nabopolassar ruled Babylon. On the 8th day of the month Ab, he died. In the month Elul, Nebuchadnezzar II returned to Babylon, and on the 1st day of the month Elul, he ascended the royal throne in Babylon. In his accession year, Nebuchadnezzar II returned to Hattu. Until the month Shebat, he marched about victoriously in Hattu. In the month Shebat, he took the vast booty of Hattu to Babylon. The first year of Nebuchadnezzar II, in the month Sivan, he mustered his army and marched to Hattu. Until the month Kislev, he marched about victoriously in Hattu. All the kings of Hattu came into his presence, and he received their vast tribute." End quote. The chronicle makes evident the far-reaching consequences of Egypt's defeat at Carchemish. Immediately after the battle in the summer of 605 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar began to take over the western areas in vassalage to Egypt, using Riblah in Hamath in Syria as his military base. The terrifying annihilation of the whole Egyptian army at Carchemish and in Hamath paved the way for a rapid occupation of the whole region by the Babylonians, and they do not seem to have met much resistance. During this victorious campaign, Nebuchadnezzar learned that his father Nabopolassar had died, so he had to return to Babylon to secure the throne, evidently leaving his army in Hattu to continue the operations there. As Wiseman points out, Hattu was a geographical term that at that time denoted approximately Syria and Lebanon. As argued by Dr. J.D. Hawkins in Realexikon der Assyriologie, it also, in an extended sense, included Palestine and Phoenicia. After his enthronement in Babylon on September 7, 605, Nebuchadnezzar quickly went back to the Hattu territory, where he marched about victoriously for some months, until the month Shebat, which is the 11th month, corresponding to February 604 BCE. Evidently, most of the countries in the west had now been brought under Babylonian control, and he could therefore take a heavy tribute to Babylon, which also, as will be shown immediately, included prisoners from Judah and adjacent countries. Early in his first regnal year, in June of 604 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar led another campaign to Hattu to maintain his rule over the conquered territories. Similar campaigns are also recorded for the following years. Clearly, the nations in the Hattu area became vassals to Babylon very soon after the battle at Carchemish. The 70 years of servitude had evidently begun to run their course. Subheading A4, the Babylonian occupation of Hattu, and Daniel 1:1-6. Not only did Nebuchadnezzar bring a number of the nations surrounding Judah under his dominion in 605 BCE, but he also laid siege to Jerusalem and brought some Jewish captives to Babylon in that very year. This is clear from Daniel 1:1-6. In recording the event, Daniel states that it occurred in the 3rd year of the kingship of Jehoiakim, yet the siege and deportation apparently followed the battle of Carchemish, which Jeremiah places in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. This seeming contradiction has caused much debate, and different solutions have been proposed in order to resolve the difficulty. But if, as is pointed out in Note 19, the different methods of reckoning regnal years in Judah and Babylon are taken into consideration, the whole matter is easily cleared up. Daniel, as a Jewish exile living in Babylon and as an official at the Babylonian court, quite naturally conformed to the Babylonian regnal year system and adopted the accession year method, and even did so when referring to to Jewish kings. This method of counting would make Jehoiakim's fourth year his third in accordance with the accession year system. Daniel 1:2 states that at this time Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This does not necessarily imply that the city was taken and Jehoiakim brought captive to Babylon. To be given into someone's hand may simply mean to be forced into submission. The indication is that Jehoiakim capitulated and became a tributary to the king of Babylon. He evidently paid a tribute to Nebuchadnezzar at this time in the form of some of the vessels of the house of God, as quoted in Daniel chapter 1, verse 2. As this clearly points to the beginning of the servitude early in the reign of Jehoiakim, the Watchtower Society has advanced several arguments against a natural and direct reading of this text. Thus it holds that the third year should be understood as the third year of Jehoiakim's vassalage to Nebuchadnezzar, which, it is argued, was his 11th and last regnal year, which partly overlapped the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar, or his 8th year in the non-accession year system. But this explanation directly contradicts Daniel chapter 2, verse 1, which shows Daniel at the court of Nebuchadnezzar and interpreting his dream of the image already in the 2nd year of this king. If Daniel was brought to Babylon in Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year, how could he be there interpreting his dreams in his 2nd year? So to save their interpretation, this text too had to be changed and made to say something else besides what it clearly says. Two different explanations have been offered through the years. The last one being that in this verse Daniel reckons Nebuchadnezzar's years from the destruction of Jerusalem in his 18th year. Nebuchadnezzar's 2nd year then should be understood as his 19th year, the 20th year in the non-accession year system. Thus, once again, we find that the application of the 70 years held to by the Watchtower Society contradicts the Bible, this time Daniel 1:1 and 2, and chapter 2, verse 1. In order to uphold its theory, it's forced to reject the easiest and most direct reading of these texts. That some Jewish captives had already been brought to Babylon in the year of Nebuchadnezzar's accession is also confirmed by Berossus in his Babylonian history written in the 3rd century BCE. His account of the events of this year reads as follows, quote, Nabopolassar, his father, heard that the satrap who had been posted to Egypt, Cole, Syria, and Phoenicia, had become a rebel. No longer himself equal to the task, he entrusted a portion of his army to his son Nabuchodonosor, who was still in the prime of life, and sent him against the rebel. Nabuchodonosor drew up his force in battle, ordered and engaged the rebel. He defeated him and subjected the country to the rule of the Babylonians again. At this very time, Nabopolassar, his father, fell ill and died in the city of the Babylonians after having been king for 21 years. Nabuchodonosor learned of his father's death shortly thereafter. After he arranged affairs in Egypt and the remaining territory, he ordered some of his friends to bring the Jewish, Phoenician, Syrian, and Egyptian prisoners together with the bulk of the army and the rest of the booty to Babylonia. He himself set out with a few companions and reached Babylon by crossing the desert. End quote. Thus, Berossus gives support to Daniel's statement that Jewish captives were brought to Babylon in the year of Nebuchadnezzar's accession. This confirmation of Daniel 1:1 is important because, as was shown in chapter 3, Berossus derived his information from the Babylonian Chronicles, or sources close to those documents, originally written during the Neo-Babylonian era itself. Subheading A5, the servitude as reflected in Jeremiah, chapters 27, 28, and 35. That the servitude of these nations began long before the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE is also clear from Jeremiah chapters 27, 28, and 35. In chapter 27, as discussed earlier, Jeremiah urges Zedekiah not to revolt, but to bring his neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him. The context shows this occurred in the 4th year of Zedekiah, that is, in 595-94 BCE. The background of this word from Jehovah was, according to verse 2, that messengers had come to Zedekiah from Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon. apparently in order to enlist him in an extensive revolt against the Babylonian yoke. Obviously, all these nations were vassals to Babylon at this time, as was Judah. The revolt plans aroused unfounded hopes and enthusiasm among the people, and the prophet Hananiah even foretold that the Babylonian yoke would be broken within 2 years. Quote, "This is what Jehovah of armies, the God of Israel, has said. I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon. Within 2 full years more, I am bringing back to this place all the utensils of the house of Jehovah that Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon took from this place, that he might bring them to Babylon." End quote. This prophecy, of course, presupposed that the Babylonian yoke had already been put on the neck of the nations. That is why Hananiah could take the yoke bar from the neck of Jeremiah, break it, and say, "This is what Jehovah has said. Just like this, I shall break the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon within 2 full years more from off the neck of the nations." End quote. So in the 4th year of Zedekiah, the Babylonian yoke lay on the neck of all the nations. The servitude was a hard felt reality for all these nations at that time, and had evidently been so for a number of years. The Babylonian invasion of Judah soon after the battle at Carchemish is also reflected in Jeremiah chapter 35, dated "in the days of Jehoiakim the son of Josiah." The Rechabites, who normally dwelt in the tents in obedience to the command of their forefather, Jehonadab the son of Rechab, lived in Jerusalem at that time. Why? They explained to Jeremiah, quote, "But it came about when Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon came up against the land, and we began to say, 'Come and let us enter into Jerusalem, because of the military force of the Chaldeans, and because of the military force of the Syrians, and let us dwell in Jerusalem.'" End quote. Thus, sometime earlier in the reign of Jehoiakim, the Babylonian army had invaded the territory of Judah, forcing the Rechabites to seek refuge inside the walls of Jerusalem. Either this invasion was the one described in Daniel 1:1 and 2, or the one that took place in the following year, when, according to the Babylonian Chronicle, all the kings of Hattu presented their tribute to the Babylonian king as a sign of their vassalage. That Judah became a vassal of Babylon early in the reign of Jehoiakim is clearly stated in 2 Kings 24:1, which says that in the days of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon came up, and so Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. However, he turned back and rebelled against him. This rebellion caused the king of Babylon to send against him marauder bands of Chaldeans, and marauder bands of Syrians, and marauder bands of Moabites, and marauder bands of the sons of Ammon. These nations were now obviously under the control of the king of Babylon, and he kept sending them against Judah to destroy it. Quoting verse 2. "It has been demonstrated above that Jeremiah's prediction of the 70 years in Jeremiah 25:10-12 did not refer to a period of complete desolation of Jerusalem, but a period of servitude, not for Judah, but for these nations, that is, the nations surrounding Judah. It was further shown that the Bible and secular historical sources, such as the Babylonian Chronicle and Berossus, all agree that the servitude for these nations began long before the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. The Babylonian Chronicle, BM 21946, shows that Nebuchadnezzar started to conquer these areas immediately after the Battle of Carchemish in 605. Daniel 1:1-6 relates that Nebuchadnezzar in the same year laid siege to Jerusalem and brought Jewish captives to Babylon. Berossus confirms Daniel 1:1-6 with respect to this first deportation, which probably was rather small. Jeremiah chapters 27, 28, and 35 all show that Judah and the surrounding nations were vassals to Babylon as early as in the reign of Jehoiakim, and this is also apparent from 2 Kings 24:1 and 2. For Judah and a number of the surrounding nations, the servitude evidently began in the same year Jeremiah uttered his prophecy, that is, in 605 BCE. The application of the 70 years made by the Watchtower Society, on the other hand, is in direct conflict with the prophecy of Jeremiah. It applies the 70 years to Judah only, ignoring the fact that Jeremiah's prophecy refers to a period of servitude for a number of nations, not a state of complete desolation without an inhabitant of Jerusalem and Judah. The next text, which deals with the 70 years, will be seen to be in direct conflict with the Society's application as well. Subheading B, Jeremiah 29:10. Jeremiah's second reference to the 70 years is given in a letter that Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the Jews who had been deported to Babylon. Not only those who had been brought there in the first deportation in 605 BCE, but also those, quote, whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon after Jeconiah the king. That equals Jehoiachin, as you can see in 2 Kings 24, 10 through 15. And the lady and the court officials, the princes of Judah and Jerusalem, and the craftsmen and the builders of bulwarks had gone forth from Jerusalem. End quote. This would date the prophecy to the reign of Zedekiah, and probably about the same time as the preceding chapter, that is, to the 4th year of Zedekiah, in 595 to 94 BCE. The background situation seems to have been the same in both chapters. The widespread revolt plans which stirred up hopes of liberation from the Babylonian yoke in Judah and the surrounding nations also reached the exiles at Babylon. As in Judah, false prophets arose among the Jews at Babylon and promised release in a short time. This was the reason why at this time, several years prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, Jeremiah sent a letter to these exiles at Babylon calling their attention to the prophecy of the 70 years. Quoting Jeremiah 29, 8 through 10, "For this is what Jehovah of armies, the God of Israel, has said. Let not your prophets who are in among you and your practicers of divination deceive you, and do not you listen to their dreams that they are dreaming. For it is in falsehood that they are prophesying to you in my name. I have not sent them, is the utterance of Jehovah. For this is why Jehovah has said, in accord with the fulfilling of 70 years at Babylon, I shall turn my attention to you people, and I will establish toward you my good word in bringing you back to this place." End quote. This utterance clearly presupposed that the 70 years were in progress at the time. If the period had not commenced, why did Jeremiah connect it with the exiles staying on at Babylon? If the 70-year period was not already in progress, what relevance is there in Jeremiah's reference to it? Jeremiah did not urge the exiles to wait until the 70 years would begin, but to wait until the period had been completed. As Jeremiah sent his message to the exiles some 6 or 7 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, it is obvious that he reckoned the beginning of these 70 years from a point many years prior to that event. The context of Jeremiah 29:10 therefore further supports the earlier conclusion that the 70 years should be reckoned from a point several years before the destruction of Jerusalem. However, apart from the context, the text itself makes it clear that the 70 years can be applied neither to the period of the desolation of Jerusalem nor to the period of the Jewish exile. Subheading B1, 70 years at Babylon or for Babylon? The New World Translation's rendering of Jeremiah 29:10 seems to depict the 70 years as a period of captivity. 70 years at Babylon is the quote. Although it is true that the Hebrew preposition le, here translated at, in certain expressions may have a local sense, at or in. Its general meaning is for, to, in regard to, or with reference to, and is so rendered at Jeremiah 20:10 by most modern translations. The following examples are taken from some of the better-known translations in English. From the Revised Version, "After 70 years be accomplished for Babylon." Rotherham's, the Emphasized Bible, "that as soon as they are fulfilled to Babylon, 70 years." The American Standard Version, "After 70 years are accomplished for Babylon." The New American Standard Version, "When 70 years have been completed for Babylon." The New International Version, "When 70 years are completed for Babylon." The New Jerusalem Bible, "When the 70 years granted to Babylon are over." Other translations give expression to the same thought in other words. Smith and Goodspeed's The Complete Bible says, "As soon as Babylon has finished 70 years." Or Byington's The Bible in Living English, "As soon as Babylon has had a full 70 years." The Anchor Bible, "Only when Babylon's 70 years have been completed." The Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures, "When Babylon's 70 years are over." The Revised English Bible, "When a full 70 years have passed over Babylon." All these translations express the same thought, namely, that the 70 years refer to the Babylonian supremacy, not to the Jewish captivity, nor to the desolation following the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. That this is what the Hebrew text meant to say is supported by the fact that it is in agreement with Jeremiah's prophecy at Jeremiah 25:11 on the 70 years servitude. As long as the Babylonian king held supremacy, other nations had to serve him. The New World Translation, however, is not the only translation that renders the preposition le by at Jeremiah 29:10. Some other translations, too, use the preposition at in this text. The best known is the King James Version, originally published in 1611, which for more than 3 centuries remained the authorized version for Anglican and many other Protestant churches. In the course of time, this translation has acquired an authority and sanctity of its own. This is also reflected in modern revisions of the King James Version. A recent example is the New King James Version, published in 1982. Although the language has been modernized, the editors have endeavored to retain the text of the old venerable King James Version as far as possible. Progress made in the last 2 centuries, especially by the discoveries of numerous ancient manuscripts of the Bible, is at best reflected in the footnotes, not in the running text. That this very conservative version retains the preposition at in Jeremiah 29:10, therefore, is not to be wondered at. It is interesting to note, however, that other less tradition-bound revisions of the King James Version, such as the Revised Version, the American Standard Version, and the Revised Standard Version, have replaced at by for in Jeremiah 29:10, as shown by the quotations given above, and the latest revision of this kind, the New Revised Standard Version, published in 1990, has replaced the King James Version's 70 years at Babylon by Babylon's 70 years. Why do these and most other modern translations reject the rendering at Babylon in Jeremiah 29:10 in favor of for Babylon or some paraphrase conveying the same idea? Subheading B2. What Hebrew scholars say. Modern Hebrew scholars generally agree that the local or spatial sense of le is highly improbable, if not impossible, at Jeremiah 29:10. Dr. Tor Magnus Amble at the University of Oslo, Norway, for example, says, quote, "The preposition le means to or for, direction towards or reference to. Aside from in a few fixed expressions, it hardly has a locative sense, and in any case not here. Very often it introduces an indirect object, like respecting to or corresponding to a Greek dative. This is also how the translators of LXX have understood it, as you quite correctly point out. Thus, the translation has to be 70 years for Babel." This was from a private letter dated November the 23rd, 1990. The Swedish Hebraist Dr. Seth Erlandsson is even more emphatic. Quote, "The spatial sense is impossible at Jeremiah 29:10, nor has LXX at Babylon, but dative, consequently for Babylon." This was also from a private letter dated December 23rd, 1990. It would be easy to add many other similar statements by Hebrew scholars, but it may suffice here to quote Professor Ernst Jenny at Basel, Switzerland. This leading authority on le says, quote, "The rendering in all modern commentaries and translations is for Babel. Babel as world power, not city or land. This is clear from the language as well as from the context. By the local meaning, a distinction is to be made between where, like in or at, and where to, local, directional, to or towards. The basic meaning of le is with reference to, and with a following local specification, it can be understood as local or local direction only in certain adverbial expressions, like at the entrance. On the translations, LXX has with Babyloni unambiguously a dative, for Babylon. Only Vulgata has to be sure in Babylon, thus King James Version at Babylon, and so probably also the New World Translation." End quote. Thus, as Jeremiah 29:10 literally speaks of 70 years for Babylon, it is clear that they cannot refer to the period of the desolation of Jerusalem and its temple, or even to the period of which Jewish exile at Babylon. Rather, like Jeremiah 25:10 through 12, what is in view is the period of Babylonian supremacy. This is also the conclusion arrived at by scholars who have carefully examined the text. Some typical comments are cited in the accompanying box. Jeremiah 25:10 through 12 and 29:10 contain the prophecy of the 70 years. The next two texts to be discussed, Daniel 9:2 and 2 Chronicles 36:20 and 21, are just brief references to Jeremiah's prophecy. Neither of them pretends to be a thorough discussion of the prophecy, nor gives a detailed application of the period. Every attempt to find an application of the 70-year period, therefore, must proceed from the prophecy, not from the references to it. It is only the prophecy that gives specific details on the 70 years as follows. 1, that they refer to these nations. 2, that they refer to be a period of servitude for these nations. And 3, that they refer to the period of Babylonian supremacy. And 4, that this period would be fulfilled when the king of Babylon was punished. Such detailed information is missing in the later references to the prophecy by Daniel and Ezra. The discussion of these references, then, should always be done in the light of what the prophecy actually is about. Subheading C, Daniel 9:1 and 2. The Babylonian dominion was definitely broken when the armies of Cyrus the Persian captured Babylon in the night between the 12th and 13th of October 539 BCE on the Julian calendar. Previously in the same night, Belshazzar, the son of King Nabonidus, and his deputy on the throne got to know that the days of Babylon were numbered. Daniel the prophet, in his interpretation of the miraculous writing on the wall, told him that, quote, God has numbered the days or years of your kingdom and has finished it. In that very night, Belshazzar was killed, and the kingdom was given to Darius the Mede. Obviously, the 70 years allotted to Babylon ended that night. This sudden collapse of the Babylonian Empire incited Daniel to turn his attention to Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years. He tells us, quoting Daniel 9:1 through 2, in the first year of Darius the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, who had been made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reigning, I myself, Daniel, discerned by the books the number of the years concerning which the word of Jehovah had occurred to Jeremiah the prophet, for fulfilling the devastation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. End quote. It is not unreasonable to think that the books consulted by Daniel may have been a collection of scrolls containing the prophecies of Jeremiah. But the sources for his inquiry may as well have been limited to the letters that Jeremiah had sent to the exiles in Babylon 56 years earlier, the first of which dealt with the 70 years for Babylon. No doubt these letters, at least, were available to him. The content of Daniel 9, in fact, and especially the prayer of Daniel recorded in verses 4 through 19, is closely related to the content of Jeremiah's letters, as has been demonstrated in detail by Dr. Gerald H. Wilson. Subheading C1. Did Daniel understand the 70-year prophecy? When Daniel stated that he discerned in the writings of Jeremiah the prophecy of the 70 years, does this mean that he understood the sense of this prophecy and realized that the period had now ended? Or is he merely saying that he noticed or observed the 70 years mentioned by Jeremiah and tried to understand them? The Hebrew verb used here, bin, may contain all these various shades of meaning. However, if Daniel had any difficulties in understanding the meaning of this 70-year period, one would expect that the prayer he offered as a result of his reading would contain a plea for understanding the prediction. But not once in his lengthy prayer does Daniel mention the 70 years. Instead, the whole emphasis of his prayer is on the Jewish exiles and the conditions set forth in Jeremiah's letter for their return to Jerusalem. It seems logical to conclude, therefore, that Daniel had no problems in understanding the 70-year prophecy. As a Hebrew-speaking Jew, he would have no difficulties in understanding that the Hebrew text of Jeremiah 29:10 speaks of 70 years for Babylon, and this was with a reference to the period of Babylonian supremacy. From the fact that this supremacy had just ended, Daniel could draw only one conclusion: the 70 years had ended. Of greater importance for Daniel, however, was what the end of the 70 years could mean for his own people, the Jewish exiles at Babylon, and for the devastated city of Jerusalem and its ruined temple. And this was the subject that Daniel brought up in his prayer. Subheading C2, the purpose of Daniel's prayer. According to Jeremiah's letter, Jehovah had promised that, quote, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place, end quote. As the 70 years for Babylon were now completed and the first year of Darius the Mede was well in progress, why had Jehovah still not fulfilled his promise to bring the exiles in Babylon back to Jerusalem, the place from which they had once been deported, thus ending the desolate state of their city? Would not the end of the 70 years for Babylon be followed by the end of the exile and the desolation of Jerusalem? Why the delay? Judging from Daniel's prayer, this matter appears to have been his prime concern and the actual cause for his prayer. In his letter to the exiles, Jeremiah also had explained that Jehovah's fulfilling of his promise to restore them to Jerusalem after the end of the 70 years rested on certain conditions. Quote, if you invoke me and pray to me, I will listen to you. When you seek me, you shall find me. If you search with all your heart, I will let you find me, says the Lord. I will restore your fortunes and gather you again from all the places to which I have banished you, says the Lord, and bring you back to the place from which I have carried you into exile. End quote. The conditions to be fulfilled before the exiles could be returned to Jerusalem then were that they had to return to Jehovah by seeking him with prayer, confessing their sins, and starting to listen to his voice. And this was precisely what Daniel did. Quote, and I proceeded to set my face to Jehovah the true God in order to seek him with prayer and entreaties, with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. Daniel 9:3. From Daniel's prayer, recorded in the subsequent verses 4 through 19, it is clear that his main interest was in seeking forgiveness for his people in order they might be returned to their homeland. He knew that the devastation of Jerusalem and the desolation of the land were the curse predicted in the law of Moses. He knew that Jehovah would bring them back to their land only when they returned to him and began to listen to his voice. Awareness of this condition laid down in the law at Deuteronomy 30:1-6 and repeated and emphasized in the letter of Jeremiah is reflected in Daniel's prayer. Obviously, his interest in Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years was motivated by the exciting discovery that the end of the desolation of Jerusalem was close at hand, as the 70 years for Babylon now had been completed. Subheading C3, the relation of the 70 years to the devastations of Jerusalem. Daniel then, in his examination of Jeremiah's letter, evidently took a great interest in the fact that the end of the 70 years for Babylon was directly linked to the end of the desolation of Jerusalem. The end of the latter period presupposed and was dependent on the end of the former. Quote, only when Babylon's 70 years are completed will I visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. Jeremiah 29:10, New Revised Standard Version. This was evidently the reason why Daniel, in his reference to Jeremiah's prophecy, connected the 70 years for Babylon with Jerusalem, speaking of them as the number of years for fulfilling the devastations of Jerusalem. It was clear from Jeremiah's letter that the completion of Babylon's 70 years would entail the fulfilling of the desolation of Jerusalem by the return of the exiles. And it is this consequence that Daniel lays the stress on in his statement. Read in isolation from the wider context, however, these words could easily be misinterpreted to mean that Daniel equated the 70-year period with the period of Jerusalem's desolation. Some Bible translators have understood the text that way. Thus, Tanakh, a translation published by the Jewish Publication Society in 1985, speaks of the number of years that were to be the term of Jerusalem's desolation, 70 years. Similarly, the New International Version presents Daniel as saying that, quote, I understood from the scriptures that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years, end quote. Both of these translations, however, are freely paraphrasing the passage, which neither speaks of the term of Jerusalem's desolation, nor that it would last 70 years. None of these words are found in the original text. They've been added in an attempt to interpret the text. There's no compelling reason to accept this interpretation, not only because it is arrived at by a paraphrasing of the text, but also because it is in direct conflict with Jeremiah's own prophecy. It should be noted that Daniel himself does not equate the 70 years with the period of Jerusalem's desolation. It's only the expiration of the 70-year period, not the period as a whole, that he relates to the fulfilling of the desolations of Jerusalem. This focusing on the end of the period is totally absent in the two translations quoted above, and they both fail to translate the Hebrew word lemalot, fulfilling or to fulfill. Most translations, including the New World Translation, are more in conformity with the original text in this respect. What Daniel discovered by reading Jeremiah's letter, then, was not that Jerusalem's desolation would last for 70 years, for this is nowhere stated in Jeremiah, but that the desolations of Jerusalem would not cease until the 70 years for Babylon had ceased. The focus of the 70 years was on Babylon and her period of dominance rather than on Jerusalem. The end of Babylon's dominance would, of course, as a natural consequence or byproduct, open up the prospect for a Jewish return to Jerusalem. This is the simplest meaning of Daniel's words in the light of what was actually written in Jeremiah's letter. As the Babylonian supremacy suddenly had been replaced by the Medo-Persian rule, and the 70 years for Babylon and her international domination had thus been completed, Daniel understood, by the aid of Jeremiah's letter, that the completion of the devastation of Jerusalem was now due. This was the reason for Daniel's excitement and strong feelings, as expressed in his prayer. Subheading D, 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 23. The two books of Chronicles record the history of Israel up to the end of the Jewish exile in Babylon. These books, therefore, must have been finished sometime after that event. The last verses of 2 Chronicles connect the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years with the Persian conquest of Babylon and the end of the Jewish captivity as follows, quoting 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 23. Furthermore, he, Nebuchadnezzar, carried off those remaining from the sword captive to Babylon, and they came to be servants to him and his sons until the royalty of Persia began to reign, to fulfill Jehovah's words by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land has paid off its Sabbaths. All the days of lying desolated it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. And in the first year of Cyrus the king of Persia, that Jehovah's word by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, Jehovah roused the spirit of Cyrus the king of Persia, so that he caused a cry to pass through all his kingdom, and also in writing, saying, This is what Cyrus the king of Persia has said. All the kingdoms of the earth Jehovah the God of the heavens has given me, and he himself has commissioned me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you, of all his people, Jehovah his God be with him, so let him go up. End quote. It may be observed that the chronicler repeatedly emphasizes the agreement between the prophecies of Jeremiah and its fulfillment in the events he records. Thus the statement in verse 20 is an application of Jeremiah 27:7, quote, And all the nations shall serve him and his son and his grandson until the time of his own land comes, end quote. This time of Babylon came, the chronicler explains, when the royalty of Persia began to reign, in 539. To fulfill Jehovah's word by the mouth of Jeremiah, to fulfill 70 years. This then would also fulfill the prediction at Jeremiah 25:12, that the time of Babylon would come when 70 years had been fulfilled. Thus, the chronicler seems clearly to be saying that the 70 years were fulfilled at the Persian conquest of Babylon. What complicates the matter in our text is the statement, italicized in the quotation above, about the Sabbath rest of the land, which is inserted in the middle of the reference to Jeremiah's prophecy. This has caused a number of scholars to conclude that the chronicler reinterpreted the prophecy of Jeremiah by applying the 70 years to the period of the desolation of Judah. Such an understanding, however, would not only conflict with Jeremiah's prophecy, it would also contradict the chronicler's own emphasis on the agreement between the original prophecy and its fulfillment. So what did the chronicler mean by his insertion of the statement about the Sabbath rest of the land? Subheading D1, the Sabbath rest of the land. A cursory reading of verse 21 could give the impression that the chronicler states that the land had enjoyed a Sabbath rest of 70 years, and that this had been predicted by Jeremiah. But Jeremiah does not speak of the 70 years in terms of allowing the land to pay off its Sabbath years. In fact, there is no reference at all to a Sabbath's rest for the land in his book. Therefore, Ezra's words, until the land had paid off its Sabbaths, all the days of lying desolated it kept Sabbath, could not be a fulfillment of Jehovah's word by the mouth of Jeremiah. The two clauses about the Sabbath rest are, as has been observed by Bible commentators, a reference to another prediction found at Leviticus chapter 26. Among other things, this chapter forewarns that if the people did not obey the law of the sabbatical years, discussed in the preceding chapter, Leviticus 25, they would be scattered among the nations and their land would be desolated. In this way, the land would be allowed to pay off its Sabbaths. Quote, "At that time the land will pay off its Sabbaths, all the days of its lying desolated, while you are in the land of your enemies. At that time the land will keep Sabbath, as it must repay its Sabbaths. All the days of its lying desolated it will keep Sabbath, for the reason that it did not keep Sabbath during your Sabbath, when you were dwelling upon it." Quoting Leviticus 26, 34, and 35. Like Daniel earlier, the writer of the Chronicles understood the desolation of Judah to be a fulfillment of this curse predicted in the law of Moses. He therefore inserted this prediction from Leviticus 26 to show that it had been fulfilled after the final desolation to Babylon, exactly as it was predicted through Moses, while you are in the land of your enemies. Quoting. By inserting the two clauses from Leviticus 26, the chronicler did not mean to say that the land enjoyed a Sabbath rest of 70 years, as this was not predicted either by Moses or by Jeremiah. He does not tell explicitly how long it rested, only that all the days of lying desolated it kept Sabbath. As with Daniel, the main interest of the chronicler was the return of the exiles, and therefore he points out that they had to remain in Babylonia until two prophecies had been fulfilled. One, the land of Jeremiah on the 70 years of supremacy for Babylon, and two, that in Leviticus on the desolation and Sabbath rest for the land of Judah. These prophecies should not be mixed up or confused, as is often done. Not only do they refer to periods of different character and different lengths, they also refer to different nations. But as the two periods were closely connected, and that the end of one period was contingent on the end of the other, the chronicler, like Daniel, brought them together. Subheading D2, Jeremiah's prophecy on the return of the exiles. Many commentators hold that the chronicler ended the 70 years in the first year of Cyrus, 538 to 37 BCE, because of what he says in the last two verses. Quote, "And in the first year of Cyrus the king of Persia, that Jehovah's word by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, Jehovah roused the spirit of Cyrus the king of Persia, so that he caused a cry to pass through all his kingdom, and also in writing, saying, This is what Cyrus the king of Persia has said. All the kingdoms of the earth Jehovah the God of the heavens has given me, and he himself has commissioned me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you, of all his people, Jehovah his God be with him, so let him go up." End of the quote from 2 Chronicles 36, 22, and 23. If Jehovah's word by the mouth of Jeremiah is here taken to be another reference to the 70 years, it might prove that Ezra ended that period in 538-37. But in view of the fact that these verses actually deal with Cyrus' decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland, it is more natural to understand his reference to Jeremiah's prophecy as a reference to what the prophet said immediately after his prediction of the 70 years for Babylon at Jeremiah 29:10. Quote, "For thus says the Lord, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place." Jeremiah 29:10. Note that the prophet did not say that Jehovah would first visit the exiles, causing them to return to Jerusalem, and then as a result of that, the 70 years would be accomplished. This is how the Watchtower Society applies the prophecy. To the contrary, the prophet clearly states that the 70 years would be accomplished first, and after their fulfillment, Jehovah would visit the exiles and cause them to return to Jerusalem. The 70 years then would be fulfilled while the Jewish exiles were still in Babylon. And so what happened? Babylon fell to Cyrus, the king of Persia, in October 539 BCE, thus fulfilling the prophecy of the 70 years for Babylon. The next year, Cyrus issued his decree, allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem. The end of the 70 years at the fall of Babylon and the return of the Jews 1 year later are two separate events. And it is the last of these that Ezra is speaking of as 2 Chronicles 36, 22, and 23. His reference to the word by the mouth of Jeremiah in these verses, then, must be a reference to the second half of verse 10 in chapter 29 of the book of Jeremiah. Thus we find that 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 23 like Daniel 9:2, may be brought into harmony with the prophecy of Jeremiah on the 70 years. The chronicler ends the period while the Jewish exiles were still living in Babylonia, when, quote, the royalty of Persia began to reign in 539 BCE. He lays stress upon the fact that the Jewish exiles could not return to Jerusalem until Babylon's 70 years had been fulfilled, and the land had paid off its Sabbaths. After that, Jehovah caused them to return to their homeland in fulfillment of Jeremiah 29:10b in the first year of Cyrus. The words of the chronicler, correctly understood, cannot be taken to mean that the desolation of Judah after the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple lasted for 70 years. The last two texts to be discussed, Zechariah 1:7-12 and 7:1-5, are sometimes thought to be two additional references to Jeremiah's prophecy about the 70 years, and the Watchtower Society holds them to be so. But the evidence for this conclusion is totally lacking. None of the texts contain any reference to Jeremiah, as do Daniel 9:1-2 and 2 Chronicles 36:20-23, and the context of these texts strongly indicates that the 70 years mentioned there must be given a different application. This is also the conclusion of many commentators. This will become apparent in the following discussion. Subheading E, Zechariah 1:7-12. The first statement about a period of 70 years in the book of Zechariah appears in a vision given to Zechariah on the 24th day of the 11th month, that is, in the month Shebat, in the second year of Darius. That's quoting Zechariah 1:7. Darius' second regnal year corresponds to 520-19 BCE, and the 24th day of the 11th month may be translated to February 15th, 519 BCE on the Julian calendar. Although the Jews had resumed the work on the temple in Jerusalem 5 months earlier, Jerusalem and the cities of Judah were still in a sorry condition. That is why the angel in Zechariah's vision brings up a question that undoubtedly troubled many of the repatriated Jews. Quoting Zechariah 1:12, "So the angel of Jehovah answered and said, O Jehovah of armies, how long will you yourself not show mercy to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, whom you have denounced these 70 years?" End quote. Subheading E1, denunciation for 70 years or 90? According to the angel, Jehovah had denounced Jerusalem and the cities of Judah for 70 years. The Watchtower Society applies these 70 years of denouncement to the period 607 to 537 BCE, thus equating them with the 70 years of Jeremiah 25:10-12 and 29:10. It seems evident, though, that the reason why the angel put this question about the denouncements was that Jehovah still, in Darius' second year, 519, had not shown mercy to the cities of Judah. Or did the angel mean to say that Jehovah had denounced Jerusalem and the cities of Judah for 70 years up to 537 and then continued to be hostile against them for about 18 more years up to 519? This would make the period of hostility nearly 90 years, not 70. But the indignation or wrath clearly referred to the devastated state of the cities of Judah, including Jerusalem and its temple, which began after the destruction of Jerusalem in 587. This condition was still prevailing, as may be seen from Jehovah's answer to the angel's question, quote, "Therefore this is what Jehovah has said, I shall certainly return to Jerusalem with mercies. My own house will be built in her, is the utterance of Jehovah of armies, and a measuring line itself will be stretched out over Jerusalem. Call out further, saying, This is what Jehovah of armies has said, My cities will yet overflow with goodness, and Jehovah will yet certainly feel regrets over Zion, and yet actually choose Jerusalem." Zechariah 1:16 and 17. Counted from 587, the indignation had now, in 519, lasted for nearly 70 years, or 68 years to be exact. And if counted from the beginning of the siege on January 27, 589, the indignation had lasted for almost exactly 70 years on February 15, 519. But just 2 months earlier, the work on the foundation of the temple had been finished. From that time onward, Jehovah began to remove his indignation. From this day I shall bestow blessing. From Haggai 2:19. It seems clear, therefore, that the 70 years mentioned in this text do not refer to the prophecy of Jeremiah, but simply to the time that had elapsed by 519 BCE since the siege and destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in 589-587 BCE. That 70 years elapsed from the destruction of the temple in 587 to its rebuilding in the years 520 to 515 is also confirmed by the next text in the book of Zechariah to be considered. Subheading F, Zechariah 7, 1 through 5. Again, the event recorded in this passage is exactly dated to the 4th year of Darius, on the 4th day of his 9th month. This date corresponds to December 7th, 518 BCE on the Julian calendar. Quoting Zechariah 7, 1 through 5. Furthermore, it came about that in the 4th year of Darius the king, the word of Jehovah occurred to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month, that is, in Chislev. And Bethel proceeded to send Sherezer and Regem-Melech and his men to soften the face of Jehovah, saying to the priests who belonged to the house of Jehovah of armies, and to the prophets, even saying, Shall I weep in the 5th month, practicing an abstinence, the way I have done these, how many years? And the word of Jehovah of armies continued to occur to me, saying, Say to all the people of the land, and to the priests, When you fasted, and there was a wailing in the 5th month, and in the 7th month, and this for 70 years, literally these 70 years, as in chapter 1, verse 12, did you really fast to me, even me? End quote. Subheading F1, fasting and wailing for 70 years or 90? Why did all the people of the land fast and wail in the 5th month and in the 7th month? Speaking of the fast in the 5th month, the Watchtower Society admits, quote, It was observed evidently on the 10th day of that month, Ab, in order to commemorate how on that day Nebuzaradan, the chief of Nebuchadnezzar's bodyguard, after 2 days of inspection, burned down the city of Jerusalem and its temple. End quote. Further, the fast in the 7th month was to commemorate the assassination of Governor Gedaliah, who was of the royal house of King David, and whom Nebuchadnezzar made governor of the land for the poor Jews who were allowed to remain after the destruction of Jerusalem. For how long had the Jews been fasting in these months, in memory of the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple and the assassination of Gedaliah? For 70 years, according to Zechariah 7:5. The year 518 to 17 was the 70th year since 587 BCE. That the Jews still in 518 BCE held these fasts in the 5th month and 7th month is clear from the fact that the men from Bethel had come to ask if they, now that the faithful remnant of Jews were rebuilding the temple of Jehovah at Jerusalem, and were about half through, should continue to hold such a fast. End quote. If now the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple is dated in 607 BC instead of 587, once again this would make the time these fasts had been observed 90 years rather than 70. This is actually conceded by the Watchtower Society in the book quoted above, but no satisfying explanation is given for this discrepancy. Thus, Zechariah 1, 7 through 12, and 7, 1 through 5, both give very strong support for the year 587 BCE as the correct date for the destruction of Jerusalem. As in the case of Jeremiah 25, 10 through 12, 29, 10, Daniel 1, 12, and 2, 1, the easiest and most direct reading of Zechariah 1, 7 through 12, and 7, 1 through 7, 2, is seen to be in open conflict with the interpretation the Watchtower Society gives to the 70 years. Subheading G, the application of the 70 years of servitude. From a close examination of the text dealing with the 70 years, certain facts have been established that cannot be ignored in any attempt to find an application of the 70-year period that is in harmony with both the Bible and historical facts. 1. The 70 years refer to many nations, not Judah only. Jeremiah 25:11. 2. The 70 years refer to a period of servitude for these nations, that is, vassalage to Babylon. 3. The 70 years refer to the period of Babylonian supremacy, 70 years for Babylon, in Jeremiah 29:10. 4. The 70 years were accomplished when the Babylonian king and his nation were punished, that is, in 539 BCE, Jeremiah 25:12. 5. The 70 years of servitude began many years before the destruction of Jerusalem. Jeremiah chapters 27, 28, and 35, Daniel 1, 1 through 4, Daniel 2, 1, 2 Kings 24, 1 through 7, the Babylonian Chronicles, and Berossus all support this. 6. Jeremiah 1, 7 through 12, and 7, 1 through 5 are not references to Jeremiah's prophecy, but refer to the period from the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in the years 589 and 87, to the rebuilding of the temple in the years 520 to 515 BCE. The application given by the Watchtower Society to the 70-year prophecy, that it refers to Judah only, and to the period of complete desolation of the land, without an inhabitant, following the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, is seen to be in direct conflict with each of the above established biblical and historical facts. An application that is in clear conflict with both the Bible and such historical facts cannot have anything to do with reality. In a serious discussion of possible applications of the 70 years, this alternative is the first which must be rejected. It is held by the Watchtower Society not because it can be supported by the Bible and historical facts, but because it is a necessary prerequisite for their calculation of the supposed 2,520 years of Gentile times, from 607 BCE to 1914 CE. If their application of this 70 years is dropped, the Gentile times calculation leading to 1914 CE immediately proves false, together with all the prophetic claims and speculations that are tied to it. Subheading G1, the use of 70 as a round number. The conclusion arrived at in the above discussion is that Judah and a number of the surrounding nations became vassals to the king of Babylon soon after the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE. Does this mean that the 70-year period for Babylon must be applied to the period 605 to 539 BCE? To this suggestion, it may quite naturally be objected that the length of this period is not 70, but a little more than 66 years, which is of course true. Many scholars argue, however, that the numeral 70 in the Bible often seems to be used as a round number. It occurs 52 times independently in the Old Testament and is used with a variety of different meanings for weights, lengths of measurements, number of people, periods of time, and so forth. In a discussion of the biblical use of the numeral 70, which also includes extra-biblical occurrences, Dr. F.C. Fensham concludes, quote, "It is quite probably used as a kind of symbolic figure, just like 7. With the usage of 7 and 70, the ancient Semites tried to make a difference between a smaller symbolic figure and a larger one." End quote. When used of periods of time, it might have been used as an appropriate period of punishment. In a building inscription of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, it's stated that the desolation of Babylon and its destruction by Sennacherib in 689 BCE should have lasted 70 years. But the god Marduk, in his mercy, changed the period to 11 years. A few decades earlier, Isaiah predicted that, quote, "Tyre must be forgotten 70 years, the same as the days of one king," end quote. The explanation that the 70 years should be understood as the same as the days of one king is often interpreted to mean a normal lifespan of a king, or the full span of human life, in accordance with Psalm 90:10, where the number 70 clearly is not meant to be viewed as a precise figure. Thus, it is quite possible, and perhaps probable, that the 70 years of servitude predicted by Jeremiah were used as a round number. Such an understanding could also be supported by the fact that not all the nations surrounding Judah, some of which are obviously enumerated in Jeremiah 25:19-26, seem to have been made vassals to the king of Babylon at the same time, in 605 BCE. Some of them seem to have been brought into subjection somewhat later. The period of servitude, therefore, was not of exactly the same duration for all these nations, yet the prophet said that all of them were to serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Subheading G2, the 70 years for Babylon, 609 to 539 BCE. Although it is true that the servitude of a number of nations turned out to be somewhat less than 70 years, the prophecy does not clearly imply that the 70 years for Babylon should be reckoned from 605 BCE. It must be remembered that all nations were predicted to become servants of Babylon. All the nations must serve him and his son and his grandson, quoting Jeremiah 27:7. Some nations had become subject to Babylon even prior to the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE. If the 70 years for Babylon are counted from the time when Babylon crushed the Assyrian Empire, thus beginning a step forward as the dominant political power itself, even a more exact application of the 70 years is possible. A short review of the last years of Assyria will make this clear. Up to 627 BCE, Assyria held hegemony over many countries, including Babylonia and the Hattu area. But on the death of Ashurbanipal in that year, Assyria's power began to wane. Nabopolassar, the governor of southern Babylonia, drove the Assyrians from Babylon in 626 and occupied the throne. In the following years, he successfully established Babylonian independence. The most important source for the history of the final years of the Assyrian Empire is the Babylonian Chronicle BM 21901, which describes the events from the 10th year of Nabopolassar until the beginning of his 18th regnal year, that is from 616 to 608 BCE. In 616, Nabopolassar attacked the Assyrians and defeated them, but an Egyptian army led by Psammetichus I came up to assist the Assyrian king, Sen-Shar-Ishkun, and Nabopolassar chose to withdraw to Babylon. By this time, the Medes too began to attack Assyria, and in 614 they took Ashur, the ancient Assyrian capital. After the city had fallen, Nabopolassar, whose army arrived too late to help the Medes, made a treaty with the Median ruler Cyaxares. In 612, the two allies attacked the Assyrian capital Nineveh, captured it, and destroyed it. The Assyrian king Sen-Shar-Ishkun perished in the flames. His successor, Ashur-uballit II, fled to the provincial capital of Haran, where he established his government, still claiming sovereignty over Assyria. During the subsequent years, Nabopolassar successfully campaigned in Assyria, and by the end of 610, he marched against Haran, joined by Median forces. Ashur-uballit fled, and the city was captured and plundered, either late in 610 or early in 609 BCE. Late in the summer of 609, Ashur-uballit, supported by a large Egyptian force, headed by Pharaoh Necho, made a last attempt to recapture Haran, but failed. This definitely put an end to the Assyrian Empire. That 609 BCE marked the definite end of the Assyrian Empire is the prevailing view among leading authorities today. Some typical statements are quoted in the following box. Regarding the fall of Assyria in 609 BCE, quote, in 610, the Babylonians and their allies took Haran, and Ashur-uballit, with the wreckage of his forces, fell back across the Euphrates into the arms of the Egyptians. An attempt in 609 to retake Haran failed miserably. Assyria was finished. Professor John Bright, A History of Israel. Thus, the 70 years for Babylon may also be reckoned from 609 BCE. From that year, the Babylonian king regarded himself as the legitimate successor of the king of Assyria, and in the following years he gradually took over the control of the latter's territories, beginning with a series of campaigns in the Armenian mountains north of Assyria. The Egyptian pharaoh Necho, after the failed attempt to recapture Haran in 609, succeeded in taking over the areas in the west, including Palestine, for about 4 years, although his control of these areas seems to have been rather general and loose. But the battle at Carchemish in 605 BCE put an end to this brief Egyptian presence in the west. After a series of successful campaigns to Hatu, Nebuchadnezzar made it clear to Necho that he was the real heir to the Assyrian Empire, and never again did the king of Egypt come out from his land, for the king of Babylon had taken all that happened to belong to the king of Egypt up to the river of Euphrates. That's a quote from 2 Kings 24:7. If the Babylonian supremacy is reckoned from 609, the year that marked the definite end of the Assyrian Empire, exactly 70 years elapsed up to the fall of Babylon in 539 BCE. This period may be counted as the 70 years for Babylon, in Jeremiah 29:10. As not all the nations previously ruled by Assyria were brought under the Babylonian yoke at that same year, the 70 years of servitude in reality came to mean a round number for individual nations.